Now we want to talk about IQVIA. IQVIA stands as one of the world's foremost companies, excelling as both a clinical research organization and a vital data resource. And we're honored to have here today Alistair Greenfeld, President of Europe, Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, and Global Head of Public Health. Alistair is a loyal supporter of our endeavors and was among the first to commit to attending this conference. He was undeterred by the ongoing conflict, and he actually just landed here in Tel Aviv today from London. So please welcome Alistair to the stage.
Karen, Yaakov, thank you so much. And of course, Ronnie, thank you for the very generous invite to this amazing conference. And it is amazing to be here with you in person. Before I talk about rare diseases and the importance of patient organizations, let me just explain a bit about IQVIA, because not all of you will know who we are. So we're a team of 88,000 people in over 100 countries. We do two things. We're the largest clinical research organization in the world. We do clinical research across all therapeutic areas: oncology, CNS, rare disease, infectious diseases, etc. And then the second part of our business is we help commercialize those assets. In Israel, we have just under 300 people. We've been here for 30 years, ably led by my incredible general manager, Dikla Spangentel. And we will continue to invest in Israel for reasons I'll explain in a second. Rare diseases, why do they matter? There are 7,000 rare diseases known to humankind. And shockingly, there are only 5% of rare diseases have an approved medication. And I use the word shockingly because rare diseases disproportionately impact children. 75% of rare diseases impact children. That's the bad news. The good news is things are being done about it globally. So last year, we did just under, as an industry, 50% of all approvals through the EMA and FDA were on orphan diseases. Last year, 44% of all trials that were started were in rare diseases. And the reason behind that are fivefold, and you can see it on the chart. The first is, in the European Union and in America, you typically get 10 to 7 years exclusivity. Secondly, from an access and regulatory perspective, having rare diseases and having a medicine that shows efficacy gets faster track approval, has a lower threshold from an evidence perspective because it impacts children and it impacts people quickly. Thirdly, there are very generous tax and grants on offer. And fifthly, perhaps most importantly, by the very definition of rare diseases, you're talking about small patient populations, typically. So although you may have high price points, the impact to overburdened healthcare systems is actually minimal, especially when you look at what's happening with the obesity pandemic and the threat of bursting open healthcare system budgets. So that's why you've seen a change in rare diseases. Now, the other factor about rare diseases and why they're very different to many other therapeutic areas is patient associations and patient organizations are very important. There are a lot of them, first of all. About 20% or 19% of all patient organizations globally are rare diseases. I'll speak personally from my own experience. I have two amazing daughters, a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, and unfortunately, my 11-year-old has a rare disease. And I know from personal experience, the particular association that we're part of, it makes a difference. It makes a difference from a lobbying perspective. It makes a difference because they truly understand the impact on patient outcomes. And this matters because when you're bringing an orphan or a rare disease into overburdened healthcare systems, it's difficult. You have a lot of barriers. And patient organizations can really make a difference. First of all, they know better than anybody the impact that rare diseases can have on small populations. And therefore, their voice is represented in many trials, unlike many other therapy areas where we may claim to have the voice of the patient in the trial, but the reality is often it isn't. In rare diseases, that's very different. The other nature of rare diseases when you're bringing them to market and the barriers that exist is, and this is not a criticism of healthcare professionals, but again, rare diseases are difficult to spot. On average, rare diseases are misdiagnosed 5.5 times. We had to wait until my daughter was 7 years old to find out the particular disease she had. And why they're misdiagnosed? It's because they're hard. You're trying to spot a needle in a haystack. Remember what I said, 7,000 rare diseases and only 5% of medicines approved. And then the third, or the final area that is a challenge is obviously the overburdened healthcare systems that has been more acute since the COVID pandemic. But again, because you're talking about small patient populations, and because you're talking about, in many cases, emotive stories dealing with children, I've seen firsthand in things like neurofibromatosis or even in cystic fibrosis that patient voices and lobbying makes it different in healthcare systems getting approval. So that's why patient organizations, in my opinion, are disproportionately more important in this area than others. Now, I'm going to give you a real-life, real-world example of how patient organizations can actually impact an approval. And then I want to talk about Israel, because I think Israel has a huge opportunity to be more important on the world stage when it comes to rare diseases than is currently the case today. So here you have an awful condition, AKU, which in essence is caused by an enzyme deficiency. It's got many manifestations from a disease perspective, tissue erosion, it leads to renal failure, cardiovascular outcomes. It's an awful disease. And patient organizations back in the early 2000s got together using the registries that they had and built up funding, created a research consortium with a major pharmaceutical company in Sweden called Swedish Orphan Biotech behind it. They reached an agreement with the EMA, using their own experience to design the protocol from an endpoint perspective, and that resulted in a very fast clinical trial being recruited and then approval happening this year, which will really help children live longer lives. And so here's an example of where it really works. Now, why I talk about Israel having a disproportionately important role, and I just want to spend a few minutes on this chart. It's a busy chart, but I think it's a really important one. Israel has around about 9.2 million people. So one could argue it's a small country from a population perspective. But it has, as Professor Rice talked about earlier on, unique genetic characteristics, which I think can play well in the area of rare diseases. I won't get into the politics, but in my opinion, from a Ministry of Health perspective, you have a more benign Ministry of Health than you do in other healthcare systems. In other words, where you've got proof and value, you do get extra years from a patent perspective. You don't get that in many European jurisdictions. You have a very vocal patient organization community in Israel, and that's my diplomacy coming through. You also are blessed by not having a hugely geographical country, and so conducting trials in this country is actually easy because there's short cycle times. You have, in my opinion, world-class genetic screening, which is super important, but on its own is not enough. And in Rand's presentation, Prof. Balitz's presentation earlier on, which I thought was phenomenal, and we have a partnership with Clalit, is to really merge that great data assets and great databases with genetic screening to do the following. And just think about this for a second. You're a life sciences company. You have particularly 10 to 12 years of exclusivity. Okay? Every protocol deviation you have costs about 6 months of that cycle. Okay, so the net present value of your asset goes down every time you have a protocol deviation. Trying to create a protocol using registries, using key opinion leader input is difficult because, as I said earlier on, you're trying to find a needle in a haystack. But if we could bring to Israel and make Israel the global hub for designing protocols, using the incredible data richness that exists here with your HMOs, integrate that with biobanks and the genetic screening, to design protocols using real-world evidence that Ran talked about earlier on as a blueprint for being more efficient when it comes to trial recruitment. Not only does that benefit patients here in Israel, but we could take that blueprint to the EMA. We could take that blueprint to the FDA, and you could compress the amount of times you have to do protocol amendments because you can't find those patients. Not only is that an amazing win from a patient recruitment perspective, but from an economic perspective, it's a no-brainer. And that is why I think Israel has such an amazing opportunity to be a world leader in rare diseases. On a proportionality basis, on a per capita of 100,000 patients, you already are in a top decile. And that's a benefit for Israel. But what I'm talking about is how do we make Israel disproportionately more important on the world stage? And that's, frankly speaking, why I'm here today, and why IQVIA has built partnerships with Clalit, why we were in EMEC last year with Ronnie, seeing in real life what amazing work is done in the north of the country around rare diseases, why we're with Sheba in the next couple of days, because you have something here that is unique. And the problem is, the global pharmaceutical industry doesn't know what you've got here. It's great having Teva as a phenomenal company, but too many other companies still do research, as they should, in the United States, in Europe. But for rare diseases, I'm yet to see a country with the capabilities that you've got, which could be amplified on the world stage. So thank you once again for listening to me for a few minutes. I've got a track, I think, at 2 o'clock this afternoon around rare diseases as well. It's a pleasure to be with you here in person. And thank you all for what you do for rare diseases. You're doing great work. Thank you very much.